Thanks, Rob. And also, we have joining us here today, we have several of the brokers who are working in the Vancouver office. I think Vancouver is the newest Europe Pacific Canada office. And I'm glad we have an office here. We have some of the advisors that you can have a chance to chat with who are, I don't know, do they have a sign on or anything? Or?
They have lanyards, so you'll see them in the back there.
Yeah. But anyway, too, also when you're looking for sound economies, it's all on a relative basis because, it's kind of like a triage. Unfortunately, the governments are making similar mistakes all around the world. It's just a question of finding the governments that are making the fewest mistakes. And that's one of the problems that we have in the United States, and we just, doubled down on our most recent mistake. I don't know if anybody was paying attention, but we just inaugurated President Obama to a second term earlier today. And apparently now, he's free to unleash his inner socialist, although from my perspective, he unleashed it a long time ago. But in his inaugural address, he really was praising his vision of America, in which the government really micromanages the economy. Obama doesn't believe that capitalism works. He basically said that the free market doesn't work unless the government controls it, unless the government regulates it, which of course means that it's not free. It's not free if the government is in charge. And unfortunately, that's why we had the housing bubble. That's why we had the financial crisis. It wasn't because we had a free market. Of course, when you look at the coverage of President Obama's second term, the expectation is this is where he's going to be able to shine. He's going to write his legacy because his first term, he was dealing with the mess that he inherited. And now that he's fixed everything, now that he's corrected all the damage that unbridled capitalism did to the U.S. economy, now that we have more regulation and more government and higher taxes on the rich, now we're going to have this recovery, and Obama's going to be able to, get more of his real liberal agenda through, because now we're not going to have this big recession in the way. Well, I don't think it's going to go quite so smoothly for President Obama in his second term. I think a lot of the chickens are going to come home to roost in the second term. A lot of the chickens that he released. In fact, one of the things he did today, when he after the inauguration, he went and he formally appointed 4 new cabinet officers. One of them was, we have a new Secretary of the Treasury. And remember, I was watching him sign this document for the Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm thinking to myself, why do we even have a Secretary of the Treasury? We don't have a treasury, right? There's no treasury. All we have is debt. Maybe if we called him the Secretary of the Debt, it would be more appropriate. And that's his job, to manage the debt. And really, what the job of the Secretary of the Treasury is he's basically a pitchman to try to convince America's creditors to keep buying our debt, even though we can't possibly pay it back. In fact, I don't understand how we're able to pull this off. See, normally, when you're running a Ponzi scheme, you keep it quiet. You hope that your victims don't realize that it's a Ponzi scheme. But we come right out and tell everybody it's a Ponzi scheme, and they still line up. If you look at the negotiations that we have now over the debt ceiling, because you're going to hear about this. So now apparently the Republicans are going to, they're going to give a 4-month, they're going to raise the debt ceiling for another 4 months. But you'll hear the president say, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to default. Well, gee, that's not something you'd want to say when you're trying to borrow money. And we don't tell people that, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to raise taxes so we can pay our bills, or we're going to cut spending someplace else so we can pay the interest on our bonds. No, the president says, if we can't borrow more money, we're going to default. And the world somehow accepts this. But the belief is that U.S. treasuries represent the full faith and credit, that the U.S. taxing power stands behind it. But the presidents say, no, we're not going to tax Americans to pay these debts. If we can borrow more money, then we'll pay. But if we can't borrow the money, well, then we're going to default. And in fact, when you hear the rhetoric, the president says we have to raise the debt ceiling because America pays its bills. Well, if we paid our bills, we wouldn't have any debt. There'd be no ceiling to raise. The reason that we have to raise the debt ceiling is because we're broke. We can't afford to pay our bills, so we need to raise the debt ceiling so we can borrow money and not pay our bills. But this is the Orwellian world that we live in. But in reality, if you pay your bills, then the bill goes away. You don't owe any money. You can't pay your Visa with a MasterCard. Right? You can't just go into more debt. But that's what we're going to do, right? We're going to borrow more money instead of paying our bills. And, the irony doesn't even end, with the government, because you have rating agencies. The Fitch rating agency came out a couple weeks ago and basically said that if we don't raise the debt ceiling, they're going to downgrade us. Downgrade us if we don't agree to take on more debt. You'd think it'd be the opposite. That if we do raise the debt ceiling, because the inference is, well, as long as we can raise the debt ceiling, we'll never have to default, which is technically true, as long as you don't mind being paid back with worthless money. And if that's okay, then you got nothing to worry about. But at some point, people are going to have to recognize that being paid back with worthless money is the same thing as not getting paid back at all. Or if you get paid back with money that loses half of its value, let's say you're a Canadian and you buy U.S. treasuries. Right now the U.S. and Canadian dollar are basically parity. But let's say you buy a 30-year treasury, and when the bond matures, let's say the dollar it's 2 to 1. So, and now you get back 50 cents on the dollar, because from Canadian money, you're only going to get back 50 cents. Well, how is that different than a default or restructuring where we say we're going to pay back 50 cents on the dollar? There's no difference. And so either you default honestly or you default through inflation. But right now, people are not worried about inflation. They're worried about default. But soon they're going to realize that it's a distinction without a difference. In fact, you have some people that think inflation is a good thing. They think, well, if we just have more inflation, well, there's no way to argue that it's a good thing for a bondholder. I mean, you can try to have some cockamamie story why you think it's good for the economy in general. But I don't see how anybody can make an argument that an erosion of the value of money is good for the bondholder. Because that's all he's got. He's got a promise to be paid money in the future. And if that money is less valuable in the future, then he's suffering a real loss. But remember, they just released, I don't know if anybody saw this, but they just released the minutes from the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, FOMC minutes, for the fourth quarter of 2007. Right? And so this is right on the verge of the bursting of the biggest bubble in U.S. history, right on the verge of the worst recession since the Great Depression. And these guys at the FOMC, as far as they were concerned, everything was great. There was no problem. We had actually already entered a recession, and they didn't even know it. And the housing bubble had already burst, yet they still didn't realize it was there. And this is after it burst. And these are the guys who are still in charge. These are the guys that are making economic policy now. These are the guys that are telling us that everything is great, that we solved our problems. The same people that didn't even recognize the problems, even though they were staring them in the face. And the thing is, they should have been able to identify the problem years earlier, but they still couldn't do it. But here, if you didn't know that there was a problem by the fourth quarter of 2007, right? But the same people who said, there's nothing to worry about, those are the people who think that the U.S. economy is recovering. But we're not recovering at all in the U.S. All we've done is borrow more money and spend it. Well, that's how we got into trouble. And we're not going to solve our economic problems by just repeating the mistakes that caused them. But one of the reasons that we were able to get through this 4 years, and probably this is the main reason that President Obama was reelected, is the problems in Europe. And I think, Barack Obama, can send a thank you card to the Greeks. Because I think if it wasn't for that European crisis, we would have already seen a much bigger collapse in the U.S. But because the world became preoccupied with Europe and all of the concern through most of 2010, 11 was Europe and the Eurozone and the breakdown of the euro and the collapse of the euro. And people didn't know, if I have euros, am I going to wake up and have drachma? You know, am I going to have francs, or am I going to have lira? What's going to happen? People were very nervous about being in the euro. And I remember when the euro currency traded down to about, I think the low was maybe 116 or something against the dollar, and people were talking, oh, it's going to go to parity, it's going to go lower. So everybody was nervous. And so what did they do? They bought dollars. Even though if America was part of the Eurozone, we would be one of the countries everybody would be worried about. You know, we would be one of the pigs. We would probably be the biggest pig. But because we issue the reserve currency, everybody buys the dollar when they're worried about something else. So even though our problems are bigger than the problems that everybody is worried about, they still buy the dollar. So we benefit from everybody else's problem. In fact, if you want to even think about the irrationality of this, if you remember when the U.S. debt was downgraded by S&P, and I don't think it will ever be downgraded again. I think that we'll default on our debt before we get downgraded. But the government really jumped on S&P, and of course, you know, the government licenses all the rating agencies. You have to be licensed by the government, and there's a quid pro quo going on there. And so I don't think anybody is going to downgrade the U.S. Treasury. But when S&P did that, right, remember, people were so worried about this downgrade that they bought treasuries as a safe haven from treasuries. So that's how reflexive it is. That's how ridiculous it is that even when they're worried about America, they buy treasuries. But there's a limit, right, to how long this can go. And I think that as the problems subside in Europe, and the euro has already turned the corner. I mean, the euro is now at about 133, 134, and I think it's going higher. And so I think the pressure is now off. I mean, there's some pressure on the yen now, but it's not nearly the size of the problem that Europe. And with Europe, people were worried about default. Nobody's worried about default with Japan because they could just print. So you don't have that worry. So there's no reason to really pile into the dollar. And I think there's still a lot of traders that are probably short the euro. So there's probably a lot of euro buying. But I think that's going to put the attention back on the United States. And I think it's almost kind of maybe poetic, but Lance Armstrong is in the news a lot right now. And, of course, he's the subject of ridicule now in America. And I don't know why. I mean, we shouldn't be criticizing him, right? We should be admiring him. We should, maybe we should build a monument. Maybe we should add him to Mount Rushmore or put his picture on our money. Because we're doing exactly what Lance Armstrong did. Or what did Lance Armstrong do? He used artificial stimulus to enhance his performance. Well, that's what we do. That's our whole country. We're doping, just like Lance Armstrong, except the dope is cheap money coming from the Fed. And what do we get? Yeah, we get a short-term benefit because we have an economy that appears to be stronger than it really is. Right? Just like Lance Armstrong appeared to be a better athlete than he really was. But ultimately, look, now he's falling into disgrace. He's been stripped of his titles. He's probably going to get sued by everybody. And and in the end, he's gonna lose that money, and he's gonna give up that glory. And I think the same thing's coming for the United States when all the stimulus wears off and people realize what we're doing, the con that we're playing on the world. Because all we've done, we've been able to borrow all this money, and now we're more deeply indebted than we were before the financial crisis began. I mean, what we needed to do was deleverage. We needed to pay off debt, not accumulate more debt. That's what we've done. And the biggest culprit has been the U.S. government. The U.S. government has taken on trillions and trillions of dollars of debt, and the Fed has purchased trillions of dollars of government bonds and toxic mortgages, and its balance sheet has exploded. And now the whole country is completely addicted to 0% interest rates. In fact, we now have so much debt that the highest interest rate we can afford is 0. If you remember, it was 1% interest rates that created the housing bubble. Now we can't even afford 1%. We can't even let rates go up. Now, Ben Bernanke pretends that the reason he's not raising rates is because of the weak economy or because there's no inflation. Of course, he's lying about there not being inflation. There's plenty of inflation. But the reason they can't raise interest rates, because after all, the economy theoretically is growing, according to the government, 2% a year. Well, how does that justify interest rates at 0? It doesn't. The reason that they can't raise interest rates is because the Fed knows that as soon as they raise interest rates, we're in a worse recession than 2008. Because they've created an economy that is completely dependent on 0% rates. All of the big banks that got bailed out in TARP, all those banks are now, they were too big to fail. Well, they're even bigger now. We should have let them fail. But because they didn't fail, we propped them up, and now they're enormous. But they need these low interest rates to survive. And in fact, I think the Fed understands this, because about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, I forget, but they asked the banks to do these stress tests. And the purpose of the stress test was to see how they would withstand a crisis. And so they asked the banks to do these economic models to see how their capital would withstand a big drop in the real estate market and a big drop in the stock market. Well, the one asset that they didn't ask them to stress test was the bond market. Because under both scenarios of a drop in the stock market and a drop in the real estate market, the banks were told to assume that interest rates stay at pretty much 0, that long-term treasuries stay below 2%. Well, what happens if the bubble that bursts is the one that hasn't burst yet? Because the stock market bubble burst, the real estate bubble burst. Why not ask them to stress test the bond market bubble? Because that one hasn't actually burst yet. It might be interesting to see how the bank's balance sheets would survive a big drop in bond prices. Well, I think the reason that the Fed didn't ask them to test that is because they knew the results. They would all fail. And they wouldn't even want to raise that possibility. Because as far as the government is concerned, they can keep interest rates at 0 forever. Just like people thought that real estate prices would stay up forever. Well, they can't. They can't keep interest rates at 0 forever because they have to keep printing money to do that. And there's a limit to how much of our inflation we can export. And the deficits that we have now, right now the government is spending about 40% more than it collects in taxes. So it collects $1 and it spends $1.40. And it's just going to go up from here if you look at the trajectory. And more Americans are leaving the workforce. They're going on disability payments. And so they're not paying taxes. And you have a lot of people who are retiring and starting to collect pensions and Social Security. So the deficit is just on autopilot now. And so that's going to require more and more debt monetization. And the Federal Reserve is able to pretend that, well, it's keeping interest rates low is because inflation is still under 2%. Even though there's no way that that's true. I mean, prices are going up for just about everything at a rate that's much higher than that. Yet the government tries to pretend there's no inflation. In fact, I made this YouTube video recently just looking at the CPI. But one of the prices that I looked at, because I can actually get the real prices, because the government prices they're just made up. But between 1999 and 2012, according to the government, the price of newspapers and magazines is up 35%. These are the official numbers that the government used to calculate the CPI. Now, I know it's a small percentage, but it's just an example of the way they do math. So 35% is the price increase. Well, we actually looked at newspaper and magazine prices. And it's easy to find them because they're printed, right on the cover. And so we went back and we looked at probably 20 of the most highly circulated newspapers and magazines. New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, Sports Illustrated, all the big newspapers and magazines. And it turns out that the average increase during that time period was over 130%. 130%. I couldn't find one newspaper or magazine anywhere in the country that increased as little as what the government claimed was the average of everything. So how is that? I mean, how can the government take something that was up 135% and say it only went up 35%? Now, I don't know what they're claiming. Maybe they're claiming that the magazines are better. I don't know. I mean, they're probably worse. They probably have more ads in them. Maybe they claim that, well, you can get them for free. Some people get them online for free. Sure, and you can get it for free in the library too. But you got to go there. I mean, the whole thing to try to say that the quality is improved, all they're trying to do with the CPI is hide inflation. It's not really a tool to measure inflation. It's a propaganda tool to disguise inflation, because the Fed has to be able to pretend there's no inflation. Because if they acknowledge there's inflation, well, then they got to do something about it, but they can't do anything about it. So all they can do is lie and pretend that it doesn't exist. And in fact, Ben Bernanke even said, in his, when he changed and he said, look, the Fed now, we're going to keep interest rates low. Because before they had a time frame, right? And I always knew that they have to keep coming up with excuses. From day one, years ago when they were talking about an exit strategy, I said there was no exit strategy. The Fed can't exit, so it's all bluff. Because when they did QE1, I knew there'd be QE2. I knew there'd be QE3. I used to say there'd be more QEs than Rocky movies. Because I knew that the Fed could never stop. It's like a drug addict. You can't stop taking the drug because you're addicted to it. The economy that they created, which is based on consumption and debt, it needs that continued fix of cheap money to survive. So the Fed has to come up with an excuse. So it keeps having a new policy. So now Ben Bernanke is saying we're going to keep interest rates at 0 until unemployment is under 6.5 or inflation is over a certain level. But even then, even if unemployment gets down, they're still not going to do it because they left themselves all kinds of wiggle room. Because the truth of the matter is, if the Fed raised interest rates, as I started to say, all those big banks would fail. Because their balance sheets can't withstand it. Everybody looks at the positives of low interest rates. You've got all these homeowners now in America that have refinanced their mortgages, and everybody's got a rate of 3.5%, 4%. Well, think about it from the perspective of the lender. It's great for the borrower to be paying 3.5%, but what about the lender who's collecting 3.5%? Well, that's okay if he can borrow from the Fed at 1 or 25 basis points or 50 basis points, whatever they're paying. Because where do American banks get their capital now? They don't get it from American citizens. They don't have any money. And why would they put money in a bank anyway? And earn what, 0? I mean, you have to be an idiot to save in America, which is why nobody does it. Although, I don't know, we got a lot of idiots in America, but I guess they're not that stupid. But so the banks get the money from the Federal Reserve. So they get the money from the Federal Reserve, and they can make mortgage loans at 3.5%. They can buy treasuries. A lot of the banks are buying treasuries. I hear all the time that the banks aren't lending any money. Sure they are. They're lending it to the government. They're buying treasuries, and the government's spending it. So you've got banks that are making all these loans to homeowners, to the government, students, whatever the government guarantees, that's where they lend. But the rates are relatively low. What happens when interest rates go up? Well, what happens if all of a sudden the Fed funds rate is 4% or 5%? Well, but the banks are only earning 2%, 3%. So now all their profits turn into losses, and of course they're levered up. So now the size of the loss magnifies. What happens to the value of assets when interest rates go up? If you've got a bond that a bank bought, and the bond is yielding 2%, and yields go to 5%, what's that bond worth? Depends on the maturity, but it might be worth 70 cents on the dollar. That's a huge haircut for the bank's capital. And if they're levered, what happens to real estate prices? The only reason Americans can afford to buy a house, well, there's two reasons. One is because the government guarantees the mortgage, and the other is because they've got a low rate. But if interest rates go up, real estate prices come down. But what do Americans do when when the value of their house goes down? They mail in their keys. They don't mail in their mortgage payment. And in fact, the government has already signed a law that basically if you walk away from your mortgage, you don't owe any income taxes on the debt that you failed to repay. So real estate prices would drop. So the banks would all fail. And of course, if the Fed is tightening, what does that mean? That means there's no bailouts next time. Because the Fed can't ease and tighten simultaneously. They haven't figured out how to do that. It's one or the other. But also what happens to the government? Right? What happens to the federal government that is financing a debt? We've got a national debt now of $16.5 trillion. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the official debt that we admit to. That doesn't count all the stuff that's off the books. Fannie and Freddie owe $6 trillion, $7 trillion. FHA. You know, FHA now is the new subprime. You know, the government decided when all the private banks that did subprime loans went bankrupt, the government saw an opportunity to pick up that market share. And so they decided that they were going to corner the market on, lending money to people who couldn't pay it back. And so you can buy a house now with an FHA mortgage, 3.5% is all you need for a down payment. 3.5%, that's it. That's not, the commission to sell a house is 5%. So you're underwater the minute you close escrow. And these are all, subsidized rates. So, I mean, the FHA is already bankrupt. They just haven't asked for a bailout yet, but they're already bankrupted. But, what was I saying? I lost,
FHA is bankrupt?
Yeah, no, but before that. Huh? I digressed a couple times, but I forgot the point I was making. Huh? What? Yeah, that's right, right. So it's the tip. This is the tip of the iceberg. The $16.5 trillion is just the one part of the debt. That's the treasury debt, the direct obligations. It's not all the stuff that the government is guaranteed. But of course, these are contingency liabilities. They're still real. We have over $1 trillion of guaranteed student loans. I don't know if you've seen any of our students, but they're not good for it. Right? You got people graduating now 5-6 years, with philosophy degrees and psychology. They're living with their parents because they can't get jobs, but they have these huge debts. So these are real liabilities. So look, we just passed $60 billion worth of aid to the victims of Hurricane Sandy. Do you know that was the entire amount of the tax increase on the wealthy for 2013, and we spent it all in the first 2 weeks of the year? So how did we do anything about reducing the debt? We've already blown the money. I don't even think the checks haven't even, they haven't even collected it yet, the tax increases. So, I mean, we don't have, every time there's a national disaster, it's off budget. We don't have a line item. But you've also got the big entitlement unfunded liabilities. Social Security, Medicare. That's something like 60 or 80 trillion. It's an enormous number. That's many, many times the GDP of the country. So when we're talking about the 16.5 trillion, this is just the tip of an iceberg, of a huge, huge iceberg. But we have to pay interest on that debt. And right now, interest on the national debt is about $300 billion a year. Super cheap. $300 billion, that's not a lot on a $16.5 trillion debt. Yeah. It's a teaser rate. That's what happened in the subprime market. A lot of people were buying houses, and the reason they could get a loan was because for the first year or two, they got a teaser rate, which was much lower than the real rate. And of course, we approved people for mortgages based only on the fact that they can afford the teaser rate, when it should have been obvious that, what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years when the teaser rate expired. Nobody cared, because that was in the future. Now, what everybody assumed was that, real estate would just appreciate, and so it wouldn't matter. They would just refinance or they would sell at a profit. But when the teaser rates expire, it's a big problem. Well, we've got a huge teaser rate on the national debt. So just think about 2 years into the Obama administration, and let's say the national debt is 20 trillion. Because it's going to be, that's only 3.5 trillion. It won't be there in 2 years, 2.5, well, $20 trillion. But 20 trillion is a nice round number and it's easy to multiply. But what if interest rates go to 5%, which is not still below their historic average in the United States? And if you think about interest rates, the more debt you have, the higher the rate should be. It's just supply and demand, right? If you don't have a lot of savings and you have a lot of debt, the price of borrowing should go up. So what would happen if interest rates went to 5%, which is a lot lower than went in Spain or France or, 5%. Well, 5% of 20 trillion is 1 trillion. $1 trillion a year. Where's the government going to get $1 trillion a year to pay the interest on the national debt? That's 700 billion. I mean, think about how big that number is. Just an extra 700 billion. They always like to talk about everything in Washington. They multiply it by 10 because they want to make it sound like, so if they cut spending by 100 billion, they claim it's $1 trillion. Because they say, well, it's 100 billion a year for 10 years. That's $1 trillion. Yeah, but it's really only 100 billion, right? Because you can't count the same 100 billion 10 times. But of course, in Washington, they're not even talking about cuts. In Washington, a reduction in the rate of increase is a cut. Even though you're actually spending more, they still consider it a cut. It'd be like if, I call one of my employees in. I said, I got some good news for you. I'm going to give you a raise. I said, yeah? Your pay is now $45,000 a year. I said, wait a minute. I'm already making 50. You said you were giving me a raise. I said, yeah, I was thinking about cutting you down to 35, but I'm only cutting you to 45. So you got a raise. This is how they cut spending in Washington. But imagine what would happen. $700 billion increase. Well, that's $7 trillion over 10 years. But what would happen, again, the U.S. economy, if interest rates went up to that level, we'd be back in recession. Real estate would be collapsing. Banks would be failing. What would happen to government tax collection? Go way down. So now the deficit would get bigger. We might have a $2 trillion deficit to finance. How are we going to finance a $2 trillion deficit with interest rates at 5% and we can't even pay the interest on the debts we've already accumulated? In fact, what's going to start to happen, as people start to perceive this problem, they're going to want their money back. You see, remember, the reason that Greece had a crisis was because their creditors woke up and wanted their money back. See, a few years ago, Greece was borrowing at record low interest rates, even though they were just as broke then as they are now. The only difference is nobody cared then. But at some point, somebody began to worry, and they didn't want to keep loaning money to Greece. They wanted their money back. Well, in the next year, something like a third of our national debt matures. When you talk about our national debt, it's not long-term debt. I mean, some of it is long-term. And most of that is now owned by the Fed. They bought up all the long-term debt in Operation Twist. The public owns all the short-term paper. And so, when that debt matures, what if our creditors just want their money back? Now, if in the next year you've got $5 trillion worth of debt maturing, the government only collects $2.5 trillion in revenue, and that's when the economy is expanding. What if it's just a recession? So if our creditors don't want to roll the paper over, then it's an even bigger problem. And that's where, when the Federal Reserve says that they can withdraw this liquidity, that's an added element. Not only can't the Treasury afford to pay the higher interest rates if the Fed shrunk the balance sheet, but think about this. The biggest buyer for U.S. Treasuries right now in the world is the Fed. The Fed is monetizing debt, even though Ben Bernanke says he's not monetizing debt. I mean, that's exactly what he's doing. He's taking debt and turning it into money. He's printing money and buying treasuries. We're actually right now buying $85 billion a month. That's how much the Fed is printing. That's $1 trillion a year that they print out of thin air, and they buy treasuries and mortgages. But they're basically buying about 90% of the net new treasury issuance, right? They're printing $1 trillion. Our national debt is $1 trillion, $1.1 trillion, right? Well, What would happen if not only the Fed stopped buying, but started selling in competition with the Treasury? I mean, the impact on the market, because if you figure out, if you say that the Treasury is, the Fed is buying 90% of the new issuance, and our budget deficit is 1.1 trillion, that means the government only has to finance 100 billion in the private sector. Well, if the Fed stops buying and starts selling, and let's say the Fed tries to unload 500 billion on top of the 1.1 or 1.2, now it's 1.7 trillion that has to be financed privately? Who's going to buy those bonds? Nobody. The price would have to collapse. That's why they can't exit, right? That's why I've been calling it the Roach Motel of monetary policy since they launched it. Because I knew that they could never check out, right? If you saw that commercial, you can check in, but you can't check out. There's no way the Fed can withdraw that liquidity. Because to do so would bring about a bigger financial crisis than the one they think that they solved. And if they had the integrity to withdraw the liquidity, they never would have supplied it in the first place. Because they have to realize that all they're doing is creating a bigger problem. But again, for politicians, they don't care about that problem. They just wanted to get reelected. President Obama wanted to get reelected, just like George Bush wanted to get reelected. That's all they care about, is getting reelected. And how do they get reelected? They promise something for nothing. They promise a pain-free solution, right? More government, more spending, right? That's what U.S. politicians are telling us that we have to do. They keep saying, Americans, we need more demand. We need to go out and spend. But we're broke. We bought too much stuff. We bought stuff we couldn't afford. We borrowed money to do it. How can the solution be to spend even more, to go even deeper into debt? And if individuals won't go into debt, we'll let the government go into debt. What we actually need to do is the opposite of that. We need to stop spending. We need to save money. We need to produce more. We need to export more. But none of this is going to happen as long as the Fed is stimulating the economy, as long as they're keeping interest rates artificially low, as long as they're punishing people for saving. So we're going to keep on blowing up this bubble until it bursts. I mean, that's when the politicians will do the right thing, when they run out of alternatives, when they can't do the wrong thing. As long as they have the ability to do that, they will. And that's why, as long as the world is dumb enough to lend us money, and it seems like the Japanese are threatening to double down on stupidity and buy another 500 billion worth of treasuries or $1 trillion worth of treasuries, as if they already own $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion of treasuries. We just told them that we're going to default if we can't borrow more money, and they want to loan us even more. And they think that this is the key to stimulating their economy, to print money and loan it to us so that we can blow it buying their products. But it doesn't make any sense to sell products to people who don't have any money. I mean, yeah, we have money, but we don't have anything of value to offer in return, right? It's supposed to be trade, right? Trade is a two-way street. We don't really trade. We take. The world gives us gifts. And, we pretend to pay. But, what good is it if you just get dollars? You could buy treasuries with them. Okay, well, what can you do with the treasuries? When they mature, you can roll them over and buy more treasuries. And what can you do with the interest payments? Well, you can loan them back to us. That's what you can do. But you can't actually spend the money on anything. Because the minute the world tries to spend the dollars, that's it. Just like what happened when Bernie Madoff's customers wanted their money back. It's the same difference. As long as you roll over the debt. But as I said, we even told people that. We told the world that if we can't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to default. See, the debt ceiling is our own ceiling, right? But eventually you run into a lending ceiling. And that's when the creditors decide, I don't want to lend you more money. Well, what's going to happen then? Well, we've already said, we're going to default. And if we don't default, we're going to print. But then it's the same result. Now, people think, we had all this talk in the U.S. about the fiscal cliff. Are you hearing all that fiscal cliff stuff? I mean, what was the fiscal cliff? Because the fiscal cliff wasn't a crisis. It was part of the solution to the problem. The real problem was the cliff wasn't big enough. It was too small. We need to go over a fiscal cliff. We need to go over a huge fiscal cliff because we have this enormous budget deficit. How can we not have a fiscal cliff? In fact, this fiscal cliff was created by Congress intentionally because they didn't want to deal with the problem in 2011 when they had this budget accord. And so they said, look, we're going to put in these tax hikes and spending cuts to start January 2013. And that's how they dealt with the deficit. They postponed the pain to 2013. Well, I knew that that meant nothing because I knew that the minute we got to 2013, they would cancel it. See, Congress always agrees to spending cuts in the future and then pretends that they've cut spending, even though they've cut nothing. Because they can always talk about, hey, we're cutting $5 trillion over 10 years. Yeah, but they're cutting nothing in year one. In fact, in many cases, they increase spending in year one. But they promise. You know, it's like a diet, where you promise that you're gonna exercise and you're gonna eat less in the future, but right now you eat more junk food, you eat more donuts, and you actually gain weight. But you claim you're on a diet because you're gonna lose weight, next year. But it never happens. So they set up this fiscal cliff, and then they dismantled it. And then, you hear the policies are talking about, what's the solution? The solution is to create another fiscal cliff for another year or two. But the minute they get to that one, they're going to, well, we can't have this fiscal cliff. We can't raise taxes. We can't cut spending. And of course, the president got reelected promising something for nothing. I mean, that's how you get elected. You promise free stuff. Well, you can't tell the people that the free stuff is going to cost money, because then they'll realize it's not free. So the government has to pretend that they can supply all this stuff and just tax the rich. And they raise taxes on the rich, but now, they want to raise taxes again. But the problem is the rich are already paying in America the vast majority of the taxes. And the ironic part about it is, when they talk about taxing the rich, they say it's not going to hurt the economy because they say that the rich people have plenty of money to spend. And so if you raise their taxes, they're not going to spend less. And that might be true to an extent. But it misses the problem because they're going to save less. And people think, well, that doesn't matter because, savings is somehow a drain on the economy. But what they don't understand is it's savings that grows the economy. It's the money that we don't spend that grows the economy. That's where investment capital comes from. That's where you get investment. That's where jobs come from. They come from savings. And so if wealthy people have less to save because more of it was taxed away and sent to Washington, then you have, slower economic growth. You don't create as many jobs. You don't create as many taxpayers. So it actually might backfire. As you raise taxes on the wealthy, you end up collecting less revenue. And now your budget deficit gets even bigger. The only taxes that would actually really raise revenue would be a consumption-based tax that would hit the middle class broadly, but they don't want to do that, especially since the middle class could barely survive the taxes that already exist. So they don't want to do that. But the tax hikes on the rich are backfiring. And the other thing, too, that they don't look at is the incentives. Because now, taxes in many parts of the country, the marginal rate of tax in America is higher than 50%. People don't realize that, because we always talk about just the federal tax. But the top federal tax rate in the U.S. now is 39.9, which is 40%. But there is another 4% tax, which is for Medicare. So that's on top. So now you're at 44% is your marginal rate of tax. But what if you live in California? There's a 13.3% state income tax. So you do get a partial deduction of the state income tax on your federal, but it's phased out. So if you call it 7%, add that to 44 and 7, you're at 51%. Now, we don't have a national value-added tax, but every state has a sales tax. California's about 9%. So even after you pay the government more than 50% of your income, they're still going to take 10% of what you consume. You haven't paid your property taxes yet, or your Social Security taxes. But it's even worse for U.S. corporations, because U.S. corporations face a 35% corporate tax rate. But then when they pass their dividend income on, now the individual is taxed again at 24%. So add them up. So we already have a very high tax rate that will encourage people to not work, especially if you're wealthier. What's the point of working? I mean, people are going to value leisure more than work because people are going to be trying to reduce their taxes, not grow their income. So this kind of tax policy is going to backfire. So the budget